The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Millbrook, a town where everybody knew everybody, and secrets were currency traded over coffee at Dolly's Diner. The air hung thick with humidity, promising another scorching Midwest summer day. Cicadas buzzed their eternal song from the oak trees that lined Maple Street, where Marcus Holloway stood in his driveway, methodically checking the oil in his powder blue 1985 Chevrolet Caprice. At 42, Marcus possessed the weathered hands of a man who'd spent 2 decades working construction, building homes for families while his own had slowly crumbled. His marriage to Linda had ended 8 months earlier in a courtroom that smelled of stale cigarettes and broken dreams. The divorce papers still sat in his kitchen drawer, next to unpaid bills and photographs he couldn't bring himself to throw away. "Dad, can we bring my camera?" Violet Holloway bounded down the front steps, her auburn hair catching the sunlight like spun copper. At 14, she had inherited her mother's emerald eyes and her father's stubborn determination. The Polaroid camera dangled from a bright yellow strap around her neck, a birthday gift from Marcus just 2 months prior. "Course you can, pumpkin." Marcus wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag, his weathered face softening as it always did when he looked at his daughter. "This trip's gonna give you plenty to photograph." Violet had been the one bright spot in Marcus's increasingly dark world, while his ex-wife Linda had already moved on with her new boyfriend, a real estate agent named Dale who wore expensive suits and drove a BMW. Marcus clung to these precious moments with his daughter. Summer custody meant 2 whole months together, and he'd planned this road trip for weeks, mapping out a route that would take them through Colorado's Rocky Mountains, a place Violet had dreamed of seeing since elementary school. The Caprice's trunk was already loaded with camping gear, enough provisions for a week on the road, and Marcus's old army sleeping bag that still smelled faintly of canvas and memories. He'd saved for months to afford this trip, working double shifts and skipping meals to ensure Violet would have the adventure she deserved. "Mrs. Patterson thinks we are crazy for driving all that way," Violet said, adjusting the camera strap. "She says we should fly." Marcus chuckled, though it held little humor. Mrs. Patterson was Linda's sister, who'd made her opinions about Marcus's poor choices abundantly clear during the custody hearings. Mrs. Patterson's never appreciated the journey, only the destination. "We are gonna see America the way it's meant to be seen, from the ground up." Inside the house, the answering machine blinked with 3 unheard messages. Marcus had been avoiding his phone for days, knowing at least one would be from his foreman asking when he'd return to work, and another would likely be from Linda's lawyer about missed child support payments. Money had become a constant source of anxiety since the divorce, but Marcus pushed those worries aside. This week belonged to him and Violet. By 7:30 a.m., they were ready to leave. Marcus performed one final check of the vehicle, tires, fluids, emergency kit, while Violet took her first Polaroid of the trip. Their small house on Maple Street, captured forever in that distinctive instant film aesthetic that would later become evidence in a case file. "Ready, pumpkin?" "Ready, Dad." The Caprice pulled away from the curb with a gentle rumble, its V8 engine purring with the reliability that had made Marcus choose this particular car. He'd bought it used from a dealer in Cedar Rapids, specifically for its reputation for long-distance travel. As they drove through Millbrook's downtown, past the hardware store where Marcus bought supplies, past the school where Violet would start high school in the fall, past the diner where locals would soon gather to discuss their disappearance, neither father nor daughter looked back. Interstate 80 stretched endlessly westward, a ribbon of asphalt that promised adventure and escape. Marcus had planned their route meticulously. First stop in North Platte, Nebraska, then Denver, Colorado, and finally into the heart of the Rockies. The trip would take them through small towns and big cities, past wheat fields and mountain peaks, creating memories that Marcus hoped would sustain Violet through whatever challenges lay ahead. "Tell me again about when you and Mom drove to California," Violet said, her window rolled down to catch the morning breeze. Marcus glanced at his daughter through the rearview mirror. She'd claimed the entire back seat as her domain, spreading out travel brochures, snacks, and her collection of books. The camera sat ready in her lap, loaded with a fresh pack of film. "That was different," Marcus said carefully. "We were young and stupid. Drove straight through without stopping, arguing about directions and money the whole way. But you still loved each other then." The statement hung in the air like humidity. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, choosing his words carefully. "We loved the idea of each other. Sometimes that's not enough, Pumpkin. But you are the best thing that came from all of it." Violet snapped a photo of her father's profile, the Polaroid whirring as it ejected the undeveloped image. She waved it in the air, watching their moment slowly materialize in chemical colors. The first hours passed peacefully. They stopped in Marshalltown for gas and snacks, where Marcus let Violet pick out an armload of junk food that would have earned them both a lecture from Linda. The teenage clerk barely looked up from his magazine as Marcus paid $43.17 for gas and provisions. The receipt would later be found crumpled in Marcus's wallet, one of the last pieces of evidence showing their location and time of purchase. Back on the interstate, Violet entertained herself by photographing passing semis, amusing billboards, and the endless expanse of Iowa farmland. She had an artist's eye, Marcus noticed, always finding interesting angles and compositions. Maybe she'd pursue photography in college, he thought. Maybe she'd see the world through her lens and never have to worry about construction work or failed marriages, or the weight of adult responsibilities. "Dad, what's that?" Violet pointed to a dark smudge on the horizon visible through the windshield. Marcus squinted against the afternoon sun. Storm clouds were building to the west, towering cumulus formations that promised afternoon thunderstorms. The weather report that morning had mentioned possible severe weather, but Marcus had dismissed it. Summer storms in the Midwest were as common as cornfields. "Just weather, Pumpkin. We will drive right through it." But as they continued west, the sky grew increasingly ominous. By 2 p.m., they were driving through a landscape transformed. The bright morning sunshine had given way to an eerie twilight, with massive storm clouds stretching from horizon to horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance, too far away to hear thunder but close enough to make Marcus nervous. Violet had grown quiet, her camera forgotten in her lap as she watched the approaching storm. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the past hour, and the first fat raindrops began spattering the windshield. "Maybe we should find a motel," Violet suggested, her voice smaller than usual. Marcus checked his watch and mentally calculated their remaining cash. He'd budgeted carefully for this trip, allocating money for gas, food, and camping fees. An unplanned motel stay would strain their resources, but his daughter's safety was worth more than money. "Good idea. Let's find somewhere to wait this out." The next exit advertised gas and lodging, but as they left the interstate, Marcus realized they'd entered what locals might charitably call the middle of nowhere. The exit ramp led to a 2-lane county road that seemed to disappear into the storm. A faded sign pointed toward Winthrop, population 8. Rain began falling in earnest now, heavy drops that turned the dusty road into a slick, muddy hazard. The Caprice's wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear as visibility dropped to mere yards. Marcus slowed to 30 miles per hour, then 20, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. There, Violet pointed through the rain-streaked passenger window. A single neon sign flickered through the downpour. Sunset Motel, vacancy. The establishment looked to have seen better decades, with a small office attached to a row of 8 rooms, all connected under a sagging roof, paint peeled from the walls like dead skin, and several windows were boarded up with plywood. But it was shelter, and in their current situation, that was enough. Marcus pulled under the covered area in front of the office, relieved to be out of the driving rain. Through the office window, he could see an elderly man reading a newspaper behind a scratched wooden counter. "Stay here, Pumpkin. I will get us a room." The office smelled of cigarettes and pine sol, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of poor maintenance and long neglect. The elderly clerk looked up from his paper. Marcus caught a glimpse of the headline, something about a prison escape in Illinois, and studied the newcomer with watery blue eyes. "Caught in the storm, eh?" The clerk's voice carried a slight accent, possibly German or Austrian. His name tag read Otto. "Yes, sir. Need a room for the night. My daughter and I are heading to Colorado." Otto consulted a handwritten ledger, though Marcus suspected they were the only guests. "Room 6 is clean. $38, cash only." Marcus counted out the bills, watching his carefully managed budget take another hit. Otto handed him a physical key attached to a plastic diamond with 6 written in fading marker. "Restaurant's closed, but there's vending machines by the ice maker. Storm should pass by morning." Back at the car, Violet had been taking photos of the rain through the windshield, creating abstract images with the water droplets and neon light reflections. She looked up as her father opened the driver's door. "Room 6, Marcus announced, holding up the key. "Palace Suite." They grabbed their overnight bags and made a dash for the room, getting soaked in the 20 feet between car and door. Room 6 was exactly what Marcus had expected. Thin carpeting, twin beds with worn bedspreads, a small bathroom with a dripping faucet, and the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant fighting a losing battle against decades of human occupancy. Violet immediately went to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains, revealing their view of the parking lot and the storm beyond. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, momentary detail. Empty fields, a few scattered trees bending in the wind, and in the distance, what looked like an abandoned farmhouse. "It's kind of spooky," she said, but her tone suggested she found it exciting rather than frightening. Marcus settled onto one of the beds, feeling the accumulated stress of divorce, financial worry, and now unexpected expenses settling into his shoulders like a weight. He watched his daughter exploring their temporary shelter, taking photos of the retro furniture and vintage fixtures with the enthusiasm that made her his favorite traveling companion. "Dad?" Violet sat on the edge of her bed, the camera in her lap. "Are you okay? I mean really okay?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd tried so hard to shield Violet from his adult problems, to maintain the illusion that everything was fine, that their future was secure. But 14-year-olds were perceptive, especially ones who'd lived through their parents' divorce. "I'm okay, Pumpkin. Just worried about money, about work, about..." He gestured vaguely at the storm outside. "Adult stuff. Nothing for you to worry about. Mom says you are having a hard time." Marcus felt a familiar flash of anger toward his ex-wife. Linda had no right to burden Violet with adult concerns, to plant seeds of worry in their daughter's mind about his stability or capability as a father. "Your mother says a lot of things. What matters is that we are here, together, on our adventure. The rest is just noise." Violet seemed to accept this, returning her attention to the storm outside. The rain had intensified, drumming against the window with increasing violence. Thunder crashed overhead, close enough now to rattle the glass. They spent the afternoon and evening in the motel room, sharing snacks from the vending machine and playing cards by the light of a single table lamp. Marcus had brought a deck for the camping portions of their trip, but they served just as well for passing time during a storm. Violet won 3 hands of gin rummy before Marcus rallied for a comeback. "Tell me a story," Violet said as darkness fell outside, the storm still raging with no sign of letting up. "What kind of story?" "A mystery. Something spooky but not too scary." Marcus thought for a moment, then began weaving a tale about a photographer who discovered that her pictures revealed things that weren't there when she took them. Ghostly figures, hidden messages, glimpses of the past. Violet listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions or suggesting plot twists. By 10 p.m., the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had grown worse, with wind now joining the rain and lightning in a symphony of natural violence. The power flickered twice, plunging them into momentary darkness before the lights returned. "Maybe we should get some sleep," Marcus suggested. Early start tomorrow if the weather clears. They prepared for bed in the cramped bathroom, taking turns brushing teeth and changing into pajamas. Marcus had packed his old army t-shirt and sweatpants, while Violet wore an oversized shirt with a cartoon cat that had been her favorite for 2 years. As they settled into their respective beds, the storm continued its assault on their small shelter. The building creaked and groaned under the wind, and occasionally something would bang against the exterior wall, debris blown by the wind, or perhaps loose shutters. Bed. Yeah, Pumpkin. I'm glad we are doing this trip. Just us. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. Sleep came fitfully. The storm's noise made rest difficult, and Marcus found himself checking the time repeatedly. 11:47 p.m., 1:23 a.m., 3:15 a.m. Each time he woke, the storm seemed as intense as before, showing no signs of the promised morning clearing. At 4:30 a.m., Marcus woke to silence. The sudden absence of rain and wind was almost more unsettling than the storm itself. He lay in the dark, listening to the drip of water from the eaves and the distant sound of Violet's peaceful breathing. Outside, the neon motel sign buzzed and flickered, casting intermittent red light through the thin curtains. Marcus rose quietly and peered through the window. The parking lot was littered with debris, tree branches, pieces of roofing, unidentifiable scraps blown in from miles away. But the sky was clearing, stars becoming visible between the retreating clouds. He considered waking Violet to show her the aftermath, but decided to let her sleep. They'd have an early start ahead of them, and she'd need her rest for the long drive to Denver. At 6 a.m., Marcus's internal clock woke him naturally. The room was filled with pale morning light, and he could hear birds singing outside, the first normal sound they'd heard in nearly 18 hours. "Violet," he called softly. "Time to get moving, Pumpkin." No response. Marcus sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and looked toward his daughter's bed. It was empty. The covers were thrown back as if she'd gotten up quickly, and her clothes from the previous day were gone from the chair where she'd left them. Her overnight bag was missing, along with the yellow camera strap that had been draped over the bedside table. "Violet," Marcus called louder, checking the bathroom. Empty. Panic began to creep into his chest as he threw on his clothes and opened the motel room door. The Caprice sat exactly where he'd parked it, undisturbed by the storm. But there was no sign of his daughter anywhere in the immediate vicinity. Marcus ran to the motel office, his heart pounding. Otto was behind the counter again, or perhaps still, reading a different newspaper and sipping coffee from a stained mug. "Have you seen my daughter? She's missing from our room." Otto looked up with the same watery blue eyes, but now they held a different expression, something that might have been confusion, or might have been something else entirely. "Daughter?" Otto's accent seemed thicker now, his voice uncertain. "You checked in alone last night, friend?" "No daughter." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "What? No, that's impossible. She was with me. 14 years old, red hair, carrying a camera." "You saw her?" Otto shook his head slowly, consulting his handwritten ledger. "Says here 1 guest, room 6. Paid for single occupancy. No mention of a child." Marcus grabbed the ledger, his hands shaking. In Otto's careful handwriting, the entry read, "M. Holloway, 1 guest, 30. "This is wrong," Marcus insisted, his voice rising. "She was with me. We drove here together. She took pictures of the storm. We played cards. We talked about mysteries and photography and..." "Friend, you need to calm down." Otto's voice carried a note of genuine concern now. "Maybe you should call someone. Family member? Doctor?" Marcus backed away from the counter, his mind reeling. This was impossible. Violet had been there. She'd been real, solid, present. They'd shared snacks and stories, and she'd fallen asleep in the bed next to his. He ran back to room 6, searching frantically for any evidence of his daughter's presence. But as he looked around the small space, doubt began to creep in. Where were her fingerprints on the dusty surfaces? Where were the Polaroid photos she'd taken? Where was any trace that another person had occupied this room? The vending machine area yielded no clues. No one had purchased snacks the previous evening. The bills in the machine's collection box were old, some dating back weeks or months. Marcus returned to his car, his hands shaking as he searched through their belongings. Violet's things were gone. Her overnight bag, her camera, her travel brochures, even the snacks they'd bought at the gas station. The ones she'd specifically chosen were nowhere to be found. The only evidence remaining was in Marcus's wallet, the gas station receipt from Marshalltown. But as he examined it more closely, his blood ran cold. The receipt showed purchase of gas and a single soda, not the armload of snacks he remembered buying for Violet. Standing in the motel parking lot under the clear morning sky, Marcus Holloway faced an impossible reality. According to every piece of physical evidence, every witness, every record of their journey, he had traveled alone. But his memories of Violet, her laughter, her questions, her excitement about photographing the mountains, felt absolutely real. The conversations they'd shared, the stories he'd told her, the way she'd fallen asleep clutching her camera, were as vivid and detailed as any memory he possessed. Marcus drove away from the Sunset Motel in a state of complete psychological fracture, unsure whether he was losing his mind or if something far more sinister had occurred. He had no way of knowing that 35 years later, a construction crew renovating the abandoned motel would discover something in the wall of room 6 that would change everything. Behind him, Otto watched through the office window as the powder-blue Caprice disappeared down the county road. The elderly clerk reached for his phone, dialing a number from memory. "It's done," he said when someone answered. "He's gone. No complications." Otto hung up and returned to his newspaper, turning to a story about missing children that he'd read countless times before. Outside, the morning sun continued its rise over the empty landscape, and the Sunset Motel settled back into its patient wait for the next unexpected guest. Detective Ray Morrison stood in the rubble of what had once been the Sunset Motel, watching the construction crew work around yellow evidence tape. 35 years to the day after Marcus Holloway's report of his missing daughter, demolition work had uncovered something that would reopen one of Iowa's most bizarre cold cases. The crew foreman, a weathered man in his 60s named Dave Kowalski, approached Morrison with a manila evidence bag. "Found this inside the wall of room 6, detective. Sealed up tight, like someone hid it there on purpose." Morrison accepted the bag and peered inside. A yellow camera strap, faded but unmistakable, wrapped around what appeared to be a Polaroid camera. Even through the clear plastic, he could see there was still film loaded inside. The Holloway case had haunted the department for decades. Marcus Holloway had insisted his daughter Violet had vanished from this very motel room, but every piece of evidence suggested he'd traveled alone. Mental health evaluations had been inconclusive. Marcus showed no signs of psychosis or delusional thinking, yet his story was impossible to verify. Now, holding potential evidence that could validate Marcus's claims, Morrison felt the familiar electricity that came with breaking open a cold case. If this camera contained photos taken by Violet Holloway, it would prove she had existed, had been at the motel, and had somehow disappeared without a trace. More importantly, it would mean that someone had gone to great lengths to hide the evidence of her presence, and perhaps her fate. As Morrison carefully placed the evidence bag in his vehicle, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real investigation was just beginning. The Holloway disappearance had never been just about a missing girl and her father's impossible story. It had been about something much darker, something that required the complete erasure of a 14-year-old's existence. The truth had waited 35 years to surface. Morrison intended to make sure it didn't wait any longer. Detective Ray Morrison sat in the evidence processing room, staring at the Polaroid camera, as if it might reveal its secrets through sheer force of will. The yellow strap had been carefully removed and catalogued, but the camera itself remained unopened, waiting for the forensics team to arrive. After 35 years sealed in a motel wall, whatever images remained inside could be crucial, or completely degraded beyond recognition. Morrison had spent the previous evening reviewing the original case files, thick manila folders that told the story of Marcus Holloway's rapid descent from concerned father to suspected mental patient. The initial missing person report had been filed on June 16, 1988, exactly 35 years ago to the day. Subject reports his 14-year-old daughter Violet Holloway missing from Sunset Motel, Room 6. Subject claims daughter vanished overnight during severe storm. No evidence of second occupant found in room. Motel clerk denies seeing any child. Subject appears disoriented and potentially delusional. The file contained dozens of interviews, all painting the same picture. Marcus Holloway, recently divorced construction worker, possibly suffering a psychological break brought on by custody stress and financial pressure. His ex-wife Linda had been interviewed extensively, confirming that Violet was supposed to spend the summer with her father, but insisting that Marcus had picked up their daughter as scheduled on June 5th. But Linda's story had holes that the original investigators seemed to have ignored or explained away. Morrison's desk phone rang, interrupting his review. Morrison. Detective, this is Dr. Patricia Vance from the State Forensics Lab. I understand you have some vintage film that needs processing. That's right, Doc. Possibly crucial evidence in a cold case. How quickly can you work your magic? Well, that depends on the condition of the film and the age of the chemicals. Polaroid film from the 1980s, it's a long shot, but I have seen stranger resurrections. Give me 6 hours, and I will know what we are dealing with. Morrison arranged for the camera to be transported to the lab, then turned his attention to tracking down the original players in the Holloway case. Marcus himself had died in 2003, a construction accident in Arizona, where he'd moved after the investigation concluded. His ex-wife Linda had remarried and become Linda Peterson, still living in Iowa but now in Des Moines. More intriguingly, the Sunset Motel had a history that the original investigators had barely scratched. Morrison pulled up property records, tax filings, and business licenses, painting a picture of an establishment that had changed hands multiple times in the 1980s, always under murky circumstances. The motel had been built in 1952 by Heinrich Otto Brenner, a German immigrant who'd allegedly fled Europe after World War II. Otto had run the motel until his death in 1991, just 3 years after the Holloway incident. The property had then passed through a series of corporate owners before finally being abandoned in. Morrison noted that Otto Brenner's death certificate listed natural causes, but the man would have been in his 70s in 1988, not the middle-aged clerk Marcus had described. Either Marcus's memory was faulty, or someone else had been working at the motel that night. 35 years earlier, Marcus Holloway sat in his kitchen, staring at the telephone as if it were a venomous snake. He'd been back home for 2 hours, having driven straight through from the motel in a fugue state of confusion and mounting panic. The house felt alien to him now, every familiar object seeming to mock his certainty that his daughter had been real, had been with him, had vanished into impossibility. The custody agreement papers lay spread across his kitchen table, Linda's signature bright and accusatory next to his own. According to the legal documents, Violet was supposed to be with him for the entire summer. So where was she? Marcus's hands shook as he dialed Linda's number. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the crisp disapproval that had become her default tone when speaking to her ex-husband. Marcus, you are supposed to have Violet for another 7 weeks. Why are you calling? Linda, I need you to tell me exactly what happened when I picked up Violet yesterday. A pause. What do you mean? What happened? You came by at 7 in the morning, just like we agreed. Violet had her bag packed and ready. You two left for your grand adventure. Her tone turned mocking on the last 2 words. Describe her to me. What was she wearing? Marcus, what kind of question is that? She's your daughter? She was wearing that ridiculous tie-dye shirt she loves and her blue jeans with the hole in the knee. She had her camera, that expensive Polaroid you bought her for her birthday. Now tell me why you are asking these ridiculous questions." Marcus closed his eyes, relief flooding through him. Linda's description matched his memories perfectly. Violet had been real. She had been with him. "Something's happened, Linda. She's missing." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Marcus wondered if the connection had been lost. When Linda finally spoke, her voice was different, smaller, frightened. "What do you mean missing?" Marcus told her everything. The storm, the motel, waking up to find Violet gone, Otto's insistence that he'd checked in alone. As he spoke, he could hear Linda's breathing becoming more rapid, more panicked. "You lost her," Linda whispered when he finished. "You lost our baby girl." "I didn't lose her. Someone took her. Someone who could make it look like she was never there." "Marcus, listen to yourself. You are talking about impossible things. People don't just vanish without a trace. Call the police. Call them right now." Marcus hung up and immediately dialed 911. The dispatcher was professional but skeptical, asking pointed questions about his mental state, his drinking habits, whether he'd been taking any medications. By the time a squad car arrived at his house 20 minutes later, Marcus felt like a suspect rather than a victim. Officer Janet Walsh was a 20-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department, a woman who'd seen enough domestic situations to recognize the signs of a custody dispute gone wrong. She sat across from Marcus in his living room, her notepad ready, her expression neutral but alert. "Mr. Holloway, I need you to start from the beginning. When did you last see your daughter?" Marcus repeated his story, watching Officer Walsh's expression grow increasingly doubtful with each impossible detail. When he finished, she closed her notepad with a soft snap. "Mr. Holloway, I'm going to be direct with you. Is it possible that you and your daughter had an argument? Maybe she ran off and you are having trouble remembering exactly what happened." "No, that's not what happened." "Is it possible that the stress of your divorce, your financial situation, maybe some drinking, is it possible that you imagined your daughter was with you on this trip?" Marcus stood up abruptly, anger replacing desperation. "My daughter is missing. Someone took her. Instead of asking me about my mental state, maybe you should be looking for her." Officer Walsh's radio crackled with a dispatcher's voice. "Unit 7, we have a domestic disturbance on Oak Street. Mr. Holloway, I'm going to file a missing person report, but I have to tell you, without any evidence that your daughter was actually at this motel, without any witnesses who saw her, this is going to be treated as a potential custody violation or mental health situation rather than an abduction." After Officer Walsh left, Marcus sat alone in his house. As the weight of his situation became clear, no one believed him. The evidence supported a story in which he'd suffered some kind of breakdown, possibly even harmed his own daughter and blocked out the memory. But Marcus knew what he remembered, knew what he'd experienced. Violet had been real. The conversations, the laughter, the way she'd fallen asleep clutching her camera, all of it had been real, which meant someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase every trace of her existence. Linda Peterson, formerly Linda Holloway, lived in a ranch-style house in a suburban development that whispered of middle-class prosperity. Morrison parked his unmarked sedan in the driveway and studied the property. Well-maintained lawn, late-model cars, solar panels on the roof, a far cry from the modest Millbrook home where she'd raised Violet. Linda answered the door before Morrison could ring the bell, as if she'd been watching for him. At 68, she retained traces of the beauty that had attracted Marcus Holloway 36 years earlier, but her eyes held the weariness of someone who'd carried a terrible secret for decades. "You are the detective who called about Violet," she said without preamble. "Come in." The living room was immaculate, decorated in neutral tones with family photos carefully arranged on every surface. Morrison noticed that none of the photos appeared to include a 14-year-old girl with red hair. "Mrs. Peterson, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you about the summer of 1988. Specifically, about the last time you saw your daughter." Linda settled into a chair across from Morrison, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I have been expecting this call for 35 years. I suppose you found something at that awful motel. What can you tell me about the morning of June?" Linda was quiet for a long moment, staring at a family photo that showed her with her second husband and their twin sons. "Marcus came to pick up Violet at 7 in the morning, just like we'd agreed. She was so excited about their trip to Colorado. She'd been planning it for weeks, making lists of things to photograph, researching the best camping spots. You saw them leave together?" I watched from the window as Marcus loaded her bag into that old Caprice of his. Violet waved goodbye to me from the passenger seat. She was wearing her favorite tie-dye shirt and carrying that camera Marcus had given her. Linda's voice caught slightly. "That was the last time I saw my daughter." Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Peterson, what do you think happened to Violet?" The question seemed to break something in Linda's carefully maintained composure. Tears began streaming down her face, but her voice remained steady. "I think Marcus killed her." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Morrison had interviewed hundreds of family members over his career, and he'd learned to recognize the difference between suspicion and certainty. Linda Peterson wasn't guessing. She believed she knew what had happened to her daughter. "Why do you think that?" "Because of what happened afterward." Marcus came back claiming this impossible story about Violet vanishing from a motel room, about no one remembering her. "But I saw them leave together. Detective, I saw my daughter get in that car with her father." Linda stood and walked to a window overlooking her backyard, where sprinklers kept the lawn green despite the summer heat. "Marcus was desperate for money after our divorce. The custody payments, the child support. He was drowning in debt, and he blamed me for it. Blamed Violet for existing, for costing him money he didn't have." "Did he ever threaten you or Violet?" "Not directly, but during the custody hearings, his lawyer argued that I was poisoning Violet against him, that she'd be better off with less contact with me. Marcus wanted to take her to Arizona permanently, start fresh where no one knew about his failures." Linda turned back to Morrison. "I think he planned to kill her and disappear. When that didn't work, he came back with this elaborate story about her vanishing." Morrison considered this theory. It would explain the lack of evidence at the motel, the absence of witnesses who remembered seeing Violet, but it raised new questions about the camera found in the wall. "Mrs. Peterson, if Marcus killed Violet, how do you explain the evidence we found at the motel?" Linda's expression didn't change. "What evidence?" Morrison described the camera discovery, watching Linda's face for any reaction. She listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "Detective, that camera doesn't prove Violet was at the motel. It proves Marcus was there. If he killed my daughter somewhere else, maybe on the drive, maybe at a rest stop, he could have hidden her camera at the motel to support his story." The theory was plausible, Morrison had to admit, but something about Linda's certainty bothered him. In his experience, mothers of missing children clung to hope. Even decades later, Linda Peterson seemed to have accepted her daughter's death with unusual resignation. "Mrs. Peterson, did you ever try to find Violet yourself? Hire private investigators? Search on your own?" Linda returned to her chair, her composure fully restored. "Of course I did. For years I followed up on every lead, every possible sighting. But as time passed, I had to accept reality. My daughter was dead, and her father was responsible." Morrison left the Peterson house, more confused than when he'd arrived. Linda's story was consistent with the original investigation, but her certainty about Marcus's guilt felt off somehow. Most parents of missing children retained some doubt, some possibility that their child might still be alive. Linda had moved on completely, remarried, Had other children built a new life that seemed to have no room for the memory of her missing daughter? His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Vance at the forensics lab. Film processing complete. Results will surprise you. Come ask. Dr. Patricia Vance was waiting in her lab when Morrison arrived, her expression unreadable behind safety glasses. On the table in front of her lay 6 Polaroid photographs, each one sealed in a protective evidence sleeve. Detective, in 30 years of forensic photography, I have never seen anything quite like this. The film was remarkably well preserved. Whoever hid that camera knew what they were doing. Morrison approached the table, his pulse quickening. What did you find? Dr. Vance indicated the first photograph. This appears to be the interior of a car, taken from the back seat. You can see part of the dashboard and what looks like a man's profile, presumably the father. The image was grainy and faded, but Morrison could make out the details Dr. Vance described. The angle suggested the photographer was sitting in the back seat, looking forward. The second photo is more interesting. Dr. Vance moved to the next image. This shows the exterior of what I believe is the Sunset Motel, taken during a rainstorm. You can see the neon sign and the distinctive architecture that matches your crime scene photos. Morrison studied the image. The timestamp function on the camera would have been set to June 15, 1988. But Polaroids didn't include automatic dating. Still, the photo clearly showed the motel as it existed 35 years ago. Photos 3 and 4 appear to be taken inside a motel room. Dr. Vance continued. Generic furniture, wood paneling, 2 beds. The lighting suggests these were taken in the evening or at night. The motel room photos showed details that matched Morrison's memory of the crime scene. The same wood paneling, the same bedspread pattern, even the same water stain on the ceiling that appeared in the original police photographs. Photo 5 is where things get interesting. Dr. Vance's voice carried a note of excitement. This appears to be a man sleeping in one of the motel room beds, photographed with a flash. The lighting angle suggests the photographer was standing next to the other bed. Morrison leaned closer. The sleeping figure was clearly male, middle-aged, lying on his side with his back to the camera. The photograph captured intimate details. The way the man's hair was mussed, the old t-shirt he wore, the peaceful expression of deep sleep. And the final photograph, Dr. Vance said, moving to the last image, is perhaps the most significant for your investigation. Morrison looked at the 6th photograph and felt his breath catch in his throat. The image showed a young girl with red hair reflected in a motel bathroom mirror, taking a self-portrait with the Polaroid camera. She was wearing a tie-dye shirt and had the distinctive features Linda Peterson had described: her daughter's eyes, her stubborn chin, her shy smile. But there was something else in the photograph, something that made Morrison's skin crawl. In the background, barely visible in the mirror's reflection, was the door to the motel room, and standing in that doorway watching the girl take her photograph was a figure that definitely wasn't Marcus Holloway. Dr. Vance, can you enhance this background figure? I have already started the process. Detective, it will take a few hours, but I should be able to give you a clearer image of whoever was watching that girl. Morrison stared at the photographs spread across the lab table. They proved definitively that Violet Holloway had been at the Sunset Motel on the night of June 15, 1988. They proved that Marcus's memories of his daughter's presence were accurate, not the products of a psychological breakdown, but they also proved something far more sinister. Someone else had been in that motel room, someone who had watched Violet take photographs, someone who had been present when she vanished. The photographs raised as many questions as they answered. If Violet had been at the motel, why had Otto insisted she wasn't there? How had every trace of her presence been erased so thoroughly? And who was the figure in the bathroom mirror? The person who might hold the key to what really happened to Violet Holloway. As Morrison left the forensics lab, he carried with him the growing certainty that the Holloway case was far more complex than anyone had imagined. This wasn't a simple case of parental kidnapping or psychological breakdown. Someone had orchestrated Violet's disappearance with sophisticated precision, erasing evidence and manipulating witnesses in ways that suggested both resources and experience. The real question was, why? What could a 14-year-old girl from Iowa have possibly known or seen that would warrant such an elaborate cover-up? 35 years earlier, the telephone in Marcus Holloway's kitchen rang with the shrill urgency that could only mean bad news at midnight. Marcus had been sitting at his table for hours, surrounded by the detritus of his shattered life, divorce papers, unpaid bills, and the custody agreement that promised him 2 months with a daughter who had apparently never existed. "Hello, Mr. Holloway. This is Officer Walsh with Millbrook PD. I need you to come down to the station immediately." Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. "Did you find her? Did you find Violet?" "Just come to the station, Mr. Holloway. There are some people here who need to speak with you." The drive to the police station passed in a blur of streetlights and desperate hope. Maybe someone had found Violet. Maybe there was security camera footage from the motel. Maybe his nightmare was finally ending. But the men waiting for Marcus in the interview room weren't local police officers. They wore expensive suits despite the late hour, and their eyes held the cold professionalism of federal agents. The older man, gray-haired and lean, introduced himself as Special Agent Crawford. His younger partner remained silent, taking notes in a leather portfolio. "Mr. Holloway, we need to discuss your recent travels," Crawford began without preamble. "Specifically, your stop at the Sunset Motel. Are you FBI? Do you know what happened to my daughter?" "We are investigating certain irregularities in your story, Mr. Holloway. Our preliminary findings suggest you may have been the victim of an elaborate psychological operation." The words made no sense to Marcus. "What are you talking about?" "These photographs were taken yesterday morning, Mr. Holloway. Notice anything unusual?" Marcus studied the images, confusion mounting. "This isn't right. The motel looked different when I was there. It was in better condition. According to our investigation, the Sunset Motel has been abandoned for over 2 years. The power was shut off in 1986. There's no way you could have stayed there on June 5th. The room seemed to tilt around Marcus. "That's impossible. I spoke to the clerk, Otto. I paid for the room. Violet and I spent the night there." Agent Crawford exchanged a glance with his partner. "Mr. Holloway, we believe you and your daughter were subjects in an unauthorized psychological experiment. Someone wanted to test advanced techniques for memory manipulation and identity erasure." "You are saying someone made me forget my own daughter?" "We are saying someone made you remember things that never happened. The motel stay, the storm, even your daughter's presence on the trip. All of it may have been artificially implanted in your memory." Marcus stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. "My daughter is real. She exists. Her mother saw us leave together. We have spoken with your ex-wife, Mr. Holloway. She confirms that you picked up your daughter as scheduled. But after that," Crawford paused, choosing his words carefully. "After that, both you and Violet disappeared for 18 hours. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. If the agents were right, then he and Violet had both been victims of something far more sophisticated than kidnapping. They'd been erased, reprogrammed, their memories altered to hide what had really happened during those missing 18 hours. "Where is she now?" Marcus whispered. "We don't know, Mr. Holloway, but we believe she's alive, and we believe she's been placed in what the people responsible would call protective custody." Agent Crawford leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "Mr. Holloway, we think your daughter witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see, something that required her complete removal from normal society. Then we have to find her." Crawford handed Marcus a business card with only a phone number printed on it. "If you remember anything else about that missing day, any detail, no matter how small, call this number immediately. And Mr. Holloway, don't trust anyone else with this information. Your daughter's life may depend on it." As Marcus left the police station, his mind reeled with the possibility that everything he thought he knew about his daughter's disappearance was a lie. But if Agent Crawford was right, then Violet was alive somewhere, hidden by people with the power to rewrite reality itself. The question was, what had a 14-year-old girl from Iowa seen that was worth such an elaborate cover-up? Morrison stared at the enhanced photograph Dr. Vance had delivered an hour earlier. The figure in the bathroom mirror was now clearly visible, a tall man in a dark suit, watching Violet take her self-portrait. The man's face was partially obscured by shadow, but certain features were discernible. Thin build, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to stare directly into the camera. More disturbing was what the enhancement revealed about the motel room itself. In the mirror's reflection, Morrison could see details that didn't match his memory of the crime scene. The wallpaper pattern was different, the furniture arrangement was wrong, and there were objects in the background that suggested the room had been occupied by more than just Marcus and Violet. Morrison's computer chimed with an incoming email from the State Records Office. He'd requested all available documentation on the Sunset Motel's ownership history, and the results were finally available. What he found made his blood run cold. According to property records, the Sunset Motel had been purchased in 1987 by a shell company called Blackwater Holdings. The company's corporate filings listed no offices, no business address, and no purpose beyond real estate investment, but a deeper search revealed that Blackwater Holdings was connected to a network of similar companies, all sharing the same registered agent, a law firm in Washington, D.C., that specialized in what their website euphemistically called government contract work. Morrison cross-referenced the dates and found something even more disturbing. The Sunset Motel had been purchased just 6 months before the Holloway incident, and sold again 6 months afterward. Someone had acquired the property specifically for the period surrounding Violet's disappearance. His phone rang, interrupting his research. The caller ID showed an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Detective Morrison, this is Agent Crawford, FBI. I understand you have reopened the Holloway case." Morrison felt a chill of recognition. The name Crawford had appeared in the original case files, but only in passing references. Now, 35 years later, the same agent was calling about the same case. "Agent Crawford, I'd like to meet with you about the Holloway investigation. There are some questions about the original handling of the case." "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Detective. The Holloway case involves matters of national security that are still classified. I'm calling to advise you to cease your investigation immediately. With respect, Agent Crawford, this is a local missing person case. I don't see how national security applies." "Detective Morrison, you don't understand what you are dealing with. The Holloway case was part of a larger operation that protected American interests during a critical period in the Cold War. Reopening this investigation could compromise ongoing operations and endanger lives." Morrison felt his temper rising. "A 14-year-old girl disappeared. Agent Crawford, I don't care about your operations or your classifications. I care about finding out what happened to Violet Holloway." The line was quiet for a long moment. When Agent Crawford spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, one of genuine warning. "Detective, I'm going to tell you something that's not in any official file. Violet Holloway didn't just disappear. She was extracted, relocated, given a new identity, and placed in protective custody for her own safety and the safety of others. She's alive, Detective Morrison, and she's been living a normal life for 35 years. Where is she? That information is classified. But I can tell you that disturbing her current life would be a serious mistake for her, for you, and for national security." Agent Crawford hung up, leaving Morrison staring at his phone in frustration. The call raised more questions than it answered, but it confirmed his growing suspicion that the Holloway case was far more complex than a simple missing person investigation. If Violet Holloway was alive and living under a new identity, then everything about the original case had been an elaborate lie. Marcus Holloway had died believing his daughter was dead, never knowing she was living somewhere with a new name and a fabricated past. But why? What could a 14-year-old girl have possibly witnessed that required such drastic measures? Morrison returned to his computer and began searching for any connections between the Holloway family and events in 1988 that might have attracted federal attention. What he found sent him reaching for his phone to call Dr. Vance at the forensics lab. 3 weeks before Violet's disappearance, Marcus Holloway had been working construction on a federal building in Cedar Rapids, a project that was officially described as routine maintenance, but had required extensive security clearances for all workers. The building housed a regional FBI office, and according to the work orders Morrison located, Marcus's crew had been installing new ventilation systems that provided access to areas normally restricted to federal agents. It was entirely possible that Marcus or Violet had seen or heard something during those 3 weeks that compromised an ongoing federal operation. Something that required Violet's complete removal from normal society and the systematic erasure of evidence regarding her disappearance. As Morrison prepared to leave the office, his computer chimed again with another email. This one had no sender information and no subject line. The message contained only a single line of text: "Stop looking for Violet Holloway or you will disappear just like she did." Morrison deleted the email and powered down his computer, but the message's implication was clear. 35 years after Violet's disappearance, someone was still actively protecting the secrets surrounding her case. The question was, were they protecting Violet from the truth, or were they protecting the truth from everyone else? Rebecca Martinez stood in front of her 4th grade classroom, watching 28 eager faces as she distributed art supplies for their Friday afternoon project. At 49, she had the kind of warm presence that made children feel safe and parents trust her instinctively. Her auburn hair, now touched with silver, was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes sparkled with the genuine affection she felt for her students. "Today we are going to create memory boxes," she announced, holding up a decorated shoebox. "You will fill them with photographs, drawings, and objects that represent your favorite memories." Rebecca had been teaching for 26 years, ever since graduating from Portland State University with a degree in elementary education. Her colleagues knew her as someone dedicated to her students, someone who stayed late to help struggling readers and organized fundraisers for school supplies. They knew she lived alone in a modest apartment, that she'd never married, and that she seemed to have no family beyond the school community she'd built around herself. What they didn't know was that Rebecca Martinez had no memories before the age of 14. As her students worked on their projects, Rebecca felt the familiar ache that accompanied any discussion of childhood memories. The earliest clear recollection she possessed was waking up in a hospital bed in Portland on July 4, 1988, with doctors telling her she'd been in a car accident that had caused severe amnesia. A social worker named Miss Patterson had explained that her parents had died in the crash, that she had no other family, and that the state would help her build a new life. The amnesia had been selective and strange. Rebecca could remember how to read and write, could recall facts about history and science, but had no episodic memories of her life before the accident. No birthday parties, no Christmas mornings, no first days of school. It was as if Rebecca Martinez had simply begun existing at age 14, fully formed but completely alone. Over the years she'd tried to research her past, but every inquiry had led to dead ends, sealed records, lost documentation, and the repeated explanation that her case files had been destroyed in a fire at the social services office in Rebecca had learned to live with the emptiness where her childhood should have been. She'd built a good life in Portland, found purpose in teaching, and created a kind of family among her colleagues and students. But sometimes, especially during moments like this when children talked about their memories, she felt the profound loneliness of being unmoored from her own history. Mrs. Martinez, Emma, one of her brightest students, was holding up a Polaroid camera that looked remarkably similar to one Rebecca had seen in her dreams. My grandma gave me this old camera. Do you know how to use it? Rebecca took the camera, her hands trembling slightly as she examined the yellow strap and familiar weight. For a moment she was overwhelmed by a sensation she couldn't name. Not quite memory, but something deeper and more instinctive. These were very popular when I was your age, she heard herself say, though she had no conscious memory of ever using such a camera. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Rebecca, we need to talk. Your life is a lie. Meet me at Pioneer Courthouse Square at 6 p.m. if you want to know who you really are. Rebecca stared at the message, her heart pounding. In 26 years of carefully constructed anonymity, no one had ever contacted her about her past. No one had ever suggested that the story of her origins might be fabricated. But as she looked at her students working on their memory boxes, filling them with photographs and mementos of lives fully lived and completely remembered, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Same day. Detective Morrison sat in his car outside the abandoned lot where the Sunset Motel had stood, studying the enhanced photographs from Violet's camera one more time. Dr. Vance had worked through the night to extract every possible detail from the images, and what she'd found was extraordinary. The figure watching Violet in the bathroom mirror wasn't just any observer. It was Agent Crawford, 35 years younger, but unmistakably the same man who'd called Morrison the previous day. More importantly, the reflection showed details of a sophisticated surveillance operation. Electronic equipment was visible in the motel room, including what appeared to be recording devices and monitoring stations. Morrison's phone rang. Dr. Vance's name appeared on the caller ID. Detective, I have made another discovery. I ran the enhanced photos through facial recognition software, cross-referencing with federal databases. What did you find? The young Agent Crawford from 1988 matches current photographs of retired CIA operative James Crawford, currently living in Bethesda, Maryland. But more interesting is what I found when I enhanced the final photograph, the self-portrait of Violet in the mirror. Morrison waited, sensing something significant was coming. Detective, I ran age progression software on Violet's face. If she's alive today, I can show you what she would look like now. 20 minutes later, Morrison stared at a computer-generated image that made his blood run cold. The age-progressed version of Violet Holloway looked remarkably similar to a woman he'd seen in his research, Rebecca Martinez, an elementary school teacher in Portland, Oregon, whose background had raised red flags during his investigation. Rebecca Martinez had appeared in Portland's social services system in July 1988, just 3 weeks after Violet's disappearance. She'd claimed to be an amnesia victim with no family and no memories before age 14. Most surprisingly, her caseworker had been a woman named Patricia Patterson, the same surname as Linda Holloway's sister, who had been involved in the original custody arrangements. Morrison grabbed his phone and dialed the Portland Police Department. This is Detective Morrison, Cedar Rapids PD. I need to speak with someone about a woman named Rebecca Martinez. I believe she may be the victim of a federal kidnapping operation from Portland, Oregon, Pioneer Courthouse Square. Rebecca arrived at the square 10 minutes early, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. She'd spent the afternoon researching the phone number that had sent the text, but found no useful information. Whoever wanted to meet her had covered their tracks carefully. A man in his 50s approached her, wearing a plain business suit and carrying a manila envelope. He was tall, thin, with sharp cheekbones and calculating eyes, the kind of face that would be easily forgotten in a crowd. Rebecca Martinez. Yes. Who are you? My name is Detective Morrison, Cedar Rapids Police Department. He showed her his badge. I'm investigating the disappearance of a 14-year-old girl named Violet Holloway in 1988. I believe you are that girl. Rebecca felt the world tilt around her. That's impossible. I'm Rebecca Martinez. I was in a car accident with my parents. I have amnesia. Morrison opened the envelope and removed the enhanced photograph from the Polaroid camera. This is you, taken at the Sunset Motel in Iowa, on June 5th. You were traveling with your father, Marcus Holloway, when you both became victims of a federal operation designed to hide what you'd witnessed. Rebecca stared at the photograph, a young girl with her exact features, taking a self-portrait in a bathroom mirror. The girl in the image wore a tie-dye shirt and carried a camera identical to the one she'd held in her classroom that afternoon. This proves nothing, Rebecca whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Rebecca, your father spent 15 years looking for you before he died in 2003. He never stopped believing you were alive. Your mother remarried and moved on, but she still thinks about you every day. Morrison pulled out more documents, birth certificates, school records, family photographs showing a happy family of 3, Marcus, Linda, and a red-haired girl who looked exactly like a young Rebecca Martinez. Your real name is Violet Holloway. You were born in Millbrook, Iowa, on March 22, 1974. Your father worked construction. Your mother was a secretary at the high school. You loved photography and dreamed of seeing the Rocky Mountains. As Morrison spoke, something shifted in Rebecca's mind. Images began surfacing, not clear memories, but emotional impressions. A man with calloused hands teaching her to change a tire. A woman with kind eyes reading bedtime stories. The excitement of planning a road trip to Colorado. Why? Rebecca asked, her voice breaking. Why would someone do this to me, to my family? Morrison handed her one final document. 3 weeks before your disappearance, your father was working construction on a federal building in Cedar Rapids. His crew was installing new ventilation systems, which gave them access to restricted areas. The document was a classified memo dated June 1988, declassified only the previous year under Freedom of Information Act requests. It detailed a joint CIA-FBI operation called Project Mindbridge, designed to test advanced techniques for memory manipulation and identity reconstruction. On June 10, 1988, your father accidentally overheard a meeting between CIA operatives and Soviet defectors. The conversation included details about double agents, assassination plans, and ongoing espionage operations. Your father didn't understand what he'd heard, but he mentioned it to you during a phone call that evening. Rebecca Violet felt pieces clicking into place. The amnesia hadn't been caused by a car accident. It had been deliberately induced to hide memories that could have compromised national security operations during the final years of the Cold War. They couldn't risk your father talking about what he'd heard, and they couldn't risk you remembering the conversation. So they created an elaborate cover story. The storm, the motel, your disappearance. All of it was designed to remove you from your father's life while making him appear mentally unstable. Morrison's phone buzzed with an urgent text. Stop now or face consequences. This is your final warning. Detective, they are still watching, Rebecca said, noticing black SUVs pulling up around the square. Whoever did this to me, they are here. Men in dark suits were getting out of the vehicles, moving with the coordinated precision of federal agents. At their head was an elderly man with gray hair and cold eyes. Agent Crawford, 35 years older, but still unmistakably the figure from the Polaroid photographs. Miss Martinez, Crawford called out as he approached. You need to come with us. This man is filling your head with dangerous fantasies. But Rebecca was experiencing something she hadn't felt in 26 years. The return of suppressed memories. They came in fragments at first. Her father's laugh, her mother's perfume, the excitement of planning their Colorado adventure, then more substantial recollections. The storm that forced them to the motel, the strange man who watched her take photographs, the feeling of being observed and studied. My name is Violet Holloway, she said, her voice gaining strength. You stole my childhood. You stole my family. You made my father think he was going insane. Agent Crawford's expression didn't change. Violet Holloway died in 1988. You are Rebecca Martinez, a teacher with no family and no past worth remembering. It's better for everyone if it stays that way. Morrison stepped between Crawford and Rebecca. Agent Crawford, you are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and violation of civil rights. Crawford smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth or humor. Detective Morrison, you are interfering with ongoing national security operations. Step aside and we will forget about your investigation. The Cold War ended 30 years ago. Crawford, whatever operation you were protecting doesn't matter anymore. You'd be surprised how long the shadows of the past can reach. Detective, more agents were surrounding them now, but Morrison had called for backup before arriving at the square. Portland police units were arriving from multiple directions, their sirens cutting through the evening air. In the chaos that followed, as federal agents and local police faced off in Pioneer Courthouse Square, Rebecca made a choice that would define the rest of her life. Instead of allowing herself to be taken back into government custody, she ran to Portland International Airport. Rebecca sat in the departure lounge, waiting for the red-eye flight to Cedar Rapids that would take her home for the first time in 35 years. Morrison had given her enough documentation to prove her identity, and more importantly, he'd given her the address where her mother, Linda Peterson, now lived. The confrontation at Pioneer Courthouse Square had ended with Agent Crawford and his team being detained by Portland police, though Rebecca suspected they wouldn't remain in custody for long. Morrison had warned her that powerful people would try to silence her, to push her back into the shadows where she'd spent most of her life. But Rebecca was done hiding. The memories were returning now in a flood. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings, her father teaching her to drive in empty parking lots, her mother braiding her hair before school. She remembered the camera Marcus had given her for her 14th birthday, remembered his promise that they would see America together. Most importantly, she remembered loving and being loved, something that had been missing from her carefully constructed life as Rebecca Martinez. As her flight was called for boarding, Rebecca pulled out her phone and sent a text message to an address Morrison had given her. Mom, this is Violet. I'm coming home. Des Moines, Iowa. Linda Peterson was washing dishes when her phone chimed with the text message. She read it 3 times before her hands began shaking so violently that she dropped the phone into the soapy water. For 35 years, Linda had carried the guilt of believing her ex-husband had killed their daughter. She'd built a new life, raised 2 sons with her second husband, and tried to bury the grief and shame that had consumed her after Violet's disappearance. Linda retrieved her phone from the dishwater and called the number the text had come from. Hello? The voice on the other end was older, mature, but unmistakably familiar. Violet? Linda whispered. Hi, Mom, it's really me. I'm coming home. Linda collapsed into a kitchen chair, 35 years of suppressed emotion overwhelming her at once. Oh my God. Oh my sweet girl. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't believe your father. I'm so sorry. I gave up on you. It's okay, Mom. None of it was your fault. None of it was Dad's fault either. We were all victims of something much bigger than we understood. Cedar Rapids, Iowa, June. The reunion took place in Linda's living room, witnessed by Detective Morrison and a documentary crew that would later turn the Holloway case into a Netflix series that won 3 Emmy Awards. Linda Peterson, now 68, embraced the daughter she'd last seen as a 14-year-old girl heading off on a road trip with her father. The government's case began unraveling within days of Violet's return. Project Mindbridge was exposed as a rogue operation that had exceeded its legal authority, violating the constitutional rights of American citizens in the name of national security. Agent Crawford and 6 associates were indicted on federal charges, though most would never see trial due to their advanced age and health issues. Violet knelt beside her father's headstone, placing a bouquet of wildflowers next to the simple granite marker. The inscription read, Marcus Holloway, 1946-2003, Loving Father. Linda had chosen those words carefully, even when she'd believed he was guilty of unspeakable crimes. I'm sorry I couldn't come home sooner, Dad, Violet whispered, I'm sorry you died thinking I was gone forever." Detective Morrison stood nearby, giving her privacy for this moment she'd waited 35 years to have. The case had been officially closed, but the reverberations would continue for years. Families would be reunited, government programs would be exposed, and the truth about Cold War domestic operations would finally come to light. But for Violet, the most important truth was simpler. She had been loved. Her father hadn't abandoned her or harmed her. He had fought for her, searched for her, and never stopped believing she was alive. That knowledge would heal wounds that 35 years of lies had created. As she stood to leave, Violet noticed something she'd missed before. Next to her father's grave was a smaller marker, weathered by time and neglect. The inscription was barely visible. Violet Holloway, 1974-1988, forever in our hearts. Linda appeared beside her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "I had it made after your father died. I wanted him to know that I finally believed him, that I knew you'd been real." Violet took her mother's hand, looking at the headstone that marked the death of a girl who had never really died. Tomorrow she would return to Portland and resign from her teaching position. She would sell Rebecca Martinez's modest apartment and move back to Iowa to be close to the family she'd rediscovered. She would also continue the work her father had started, seeking justice for victims of government overreach, and fighting to ensure that no other family would be destroyed by operations conducted in the shadows. But today she was simply Violet Holloway, standing in an Iowa cemetery beside the grave of the father who had never stopped loving her. Finally home after the longest journey of her life. Violet Holloway Martinez. She had legally reclaimed her birth name while keeping the surname that honored her 26 years in Portland, stood before a congressional subcommittee investigating domestic surveillance programs. Her testimony would lead to new oversight legislation and the declassification of thousands of documents related to Cold War psychological operations. But the most important change was personal. Violet had moved back to Iowa, bought a house 3 blocks from her mother's home, and found work as an advocate for victims of government abuse. She had also begun writing a book about her experience, tentatively titled The Girl Who Disappeared, a memoir of memory, loss, and coming home. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, Violet would take out the Polaroid camera that had been returned to her as evidence. She would study the photographs she'd taken as a 14-year-old girl, images that had survived 35 years hidden in a motel wall to ultimately expose the truth. In the final photograph, the self-portrait in the bathroom mirror, Violet could now see what she'd missed as a child. Behind her reflection, watching from the doorway, was Agent Crawford. But there was something else in the image, something the forensics team had initially overlooked. In the mirror's reflection, barely visible in the corner of the frame, was another figure, an older man with calloused hands and worried eyes, standing in the motel room doorway. Marcus Holloway, her father, trying to protect his daughter from dangers he couldn't understand. The photograph captured the last moment they would spend together for 35 years. But it also captured something more important. A father's love, preserved in chemical emulsion and hidden away until the truth could finally set them both free. Violet placed the photograph in her memory box, the same kind of art project she'd assigned to her students on the day Detective Morrison found her. The box now contained items that told the story of 2 lives: Rebecca Martinez, the woman who had built meaning from loss, and Violet Holloway, the girl who had finally come home. Outside her window, the Iowa corn was growing tall in the summer heat, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of construction workers building homes for families who would never have to worry about their children vanishing into the shadows of history. The Holloway disappearance was finally solved, but more importantly, the Holloway family was finally whole.